At 4:47 p.m. on Saturday, March 25, 1911, the lamp panel at the New York Telephone Company Exchange on West Street began to light up in rapid sequence, as if someone had poured electric fire across the board. The cables in the ceiling trembled slightly, and the air, already heavy with dust blown in from the piers, coal soot from the boilers, and the smell of heated oil from machines and dynamos, seemed to shorten all at once. Within minutes, the entire city was pushing the same request through the wires. Find help, confirm addresses, reach someone before it was too late. If a connection went out late, if a number was written down wrong, a horse-drawn ambulance could turn onto the wrong street. A firefighter could arrive at a locked door too late. A family could wait on the sidewalk for a name that would not come. In that instant, the day's narrative began to take shape there, chair by chair, lamp by lamp, and the operator of position 18, Maria Lemos, 22 years old, had to keep her hands steady so the city would not become a knot. The room was long, with rows of high chairs and narrow tables, and the switchboards, with their jacks and cords, forced the operators to remain upright for hours, reaching and withdrawing in repeated motions. They wore light blouses and dark skirts. Most pinned their hair with clips so it would not brush the headset and would not snag the cords. The noise was a continuous fabric, restrained voices, the dry click of plugs going in and out, the constant hum of electrical equipment, the sound of paper being turned in subscriber lists. The supervisor, Mrs. Kavanaugh, moved behind them with quick steps, measuring posture and response time the way one measures pressure, because the service was timed and discipline was part of the contract. Until then, Saturday had been following its pattern. Merchants calling in orders, men leaving messages, mothers looking for children who were late, complaints about a buzzing line in Brooklyn, notices about deliveries on the Lower West Side, calls crossing Manhattan through cables and intermediate exchanges. The change arrived without announcement, the way things arrive that do not ask permission. The first urgent call brought a fragmented address, spoken in haste, with street noise behind it. It was a request for the fire department, and the words Washington Place and Greene Street already came loaded with smoke. Maria fitted the plug into the correct jack, pulled the cord with the gesture repeated thousands of times, and activated the service line as procedure required. Procedure required neutrality, and neutrality in that job was a tool. Do not argue, do not comment, do not delay. The fire department lamp lit, and she made the connection. Before she had even released the previous plug, another lamp flashed, then another, and the panel began to look like a crowded sky, with points of light asking passage at the same time, without waiting for anyone to breathe. Within a few minutes, the call board turned into a map of restless constellations. Lines asked for St. Vincent Hospital on 7th Avenue, and for New York Hospital. Others asked for the police station on Mercer Street. One request sought a newspaper on Park Row, another sought a priest, another sought an ambulance wagon. And along with the real request, the rumors began to come in, always faster than the facts and harder to cut off. Suspicions of a bomb, of sabotage, of locked doors, of people at the windows. Maria had no time for rumors, but rumors came through the lines like dust. She wrote down addresses on a pad with a short pencil tied on a string, trying to keep the letters legible under the pressure of the flow. Washington Place near Greene, possible Asch Building, uncertain numbers because in that part of the village commercial and residential buildings mixed and not every caller knew the exact numbering. One caller pronounced the building's name in a way that sounded like Asch, and Maria did not know whether it was a mistake or haste. She looked at Mrs. Kavanaugh and received only a short gesture, as if ordering her to continue without spending air, as if any second of explanation were a luxury the afternoon no longer allowed. The morality there was practical and immediate. It had no form of speech, no bravado. It was the obligation not to mislead the city at a moment when any mistake became a wound. Maria had been trained to be invisible. The work consisted of not existing inside other people's conversations, of being only the path, of following formulas of greeting and routing that avoided delay and avoided involvement. That afternoon, invisibility gained weight because each connection felt like a choice, and the interval between one plug and the next could be the length of a life, especially when calls came from narrow, crowded streets where sirens, whistles, and bells mixed with the sound of people running and the friction of a crowd trying to come closer and, at the same time, to flee. Shortly after 5, the calls began to bring not only requests for service, but signs of people trapped. A young voice, thin, with short breath and a background of screams, pushed an uncertain location through the line, mixed with smoke and lack of air. Maria's attempt was to turn panic into data, find a number, a floor, an entrance, something that could be passed on without ambiguity. On the other end, the information came broken, with references to locked doors and smoke rising, and there was a sound of pounding that suggested would being struck by hands or by desperation, as if someone were trying to force a way through. Protocol required insistence on the address, and Maria insisted, repeating the request for a number as if holding an anchor so she would not be dragged along. At the same time, she scribbled on the paper a likely range of numbering on Washington Place, grabbing any detail that had crossed the room in the previous minutes, because the congestion of lines meant the same information arrived in fragments through different channels, and the difference between a fragment and a complete address could be the difference between arriving and not arriving. The connection to the fire department took a second to answer, as if the exchange itself were congested, and in fact the volume of calls made the operators keep several lines on hold and switch cords quickly. When it finally opened, Maria passed along what was permitted and necessary. Fire in a factory on Washington Place, near Greene Street, possibly at number 23, many calls, people possibly trapped on upper floors. The response on the other end was brief, technical, and the line ended to make room for other urgencies, as happened when public services were already being summoned by multiple routes. When Maria returned to the call with a young voice, she found only silence. There was no formal click of hanging up. It was as if the wire had been cut. Maria held the plug in her hand for a second, listening to nothing, and then withdrew it, because new lamps were already flashing for passage, and the panel did not allow morning. The calls continued in waves. A seamstress in a boarding house on East Houston Street wanted news of her brother who worked near Washington Place and had not returned, and the word boarding house came loaded with shared rooms and narrow corridors, where messages traveled by word of mouth, and any delay became despair. A tailor on Orchard Street asked whether that factory was the same one that supplied shirts to Broadway shops, trying to link the fire to the circuit of orders and display windows, as if understanding the chain of work could help him understand what was burning. A man at the terminal near the Brooklyn Bridge tried to send a message to someone in Greenwich Village and did not know the address. He knew only a first name and the word shirt. Maria connected and disconnected, alternating between service lines, subscribers, and offices. Sweat appeared at the base of her neck, and the headset began to bother her, pressing her ear and warming her skin. The wall clock marked 5:15 when the type of call changed again. They stopped being only requests for help and became requests for confirmation. People wanted anyone, to say whether the doors had been locked, whether they were dead on the sidewalk, whether the fire had started because of a cigarette. The exchange was not a place for truth. It was a place for routes. Even so, the pressure came, and Maria answered with the only way not to lose herself inside other people's fear. Keep the procedure, wait, connect, route, as if method were the last solid thing in a day that seemed to dissolve everything. Around 5:30, A call came from someone very close to what was happening, and the sound of bells and whistles mixed in the background as if the person were looking at what they described, with the noise of vehicles and a crowd compressed at the corners. The information arrived in short phrases: ladders that did not reach, nets that did not hold, bodies in the street, need for more ambulances at the corner of Washington Place and Greene, black smoke coming from above. Maria connected to the medical service and wrote in a corner of the paper a phrase she did not know why she kept: does not reach. Perhaps because, in that instant, she understood there were physical limits to any system, and those limits were not argued with words or orders or goodwill. One simply collided with them, and the rest was consequence. The moral catalyst of that afternoon did not come as a sermon, but as the presence of an older woman who appeared in the doorway of the room, out of place, in a dark coat and mute urgency, like someone who had crossed the city without stopping to brush the street dust from the hem of her skirt. A maintenance man tried to bar her, and Mrs. Kavanaugh went to her with contained irritation. The two exchanged quick words that did not reach the operators, but the meaning of the conflict was clear in the movement of hands and the stiffness of shoulders. Someone wanted to break normal functioning, and normal functioning resisted. When the supervisor returned, she brought a dry, low order with no room for interpretation. No one would leave their post. Anyone who stood up would lose their job. Maria kept her face still, but something inside her tightened. Losing the job, for her, was not an abstract idea. Her father unloaded crates on the docks and depended on good weeks and bad. Her wages paid for the room on 8th Avenue and for the stove coal, bought in small amounts to last the week. There was a line of girls who would accept that work for the same money, because the position offered regular pay and an appearance of stability rare for those coming from domestic work or workshops. Even so, the woman's face at the door was a reminder that the fire was not a distant event. It was people crossing the city to tear a name from any place that could give it. Maria looked at the panel and saw the lights continue to come on without respect for internal rules. The city wanted passage, and it wanted it now. Soon after, a call came with a specific request. Someone needed to speak with the factory on Washington Place to warn that a brother was inside and that the mother was waiting at St. Vincent's. The voice, with an Italian accent, came fast as if speed could push the news through the wire. Maria hesitated, because she knew internal factory lines sometimes did not exist, or were busy, or had been cut by the fire itself, and that in fires the first thing to fail could be communication. Even so, she tried. On the subscriber board, among small labels, she found Triangle Waste Company written on a narrow card, as it appeared in the commercial subscriber records. Her stomach gave a small jump, as if the name had already been circulating for hours in the city's air and now took the form of paper. The connection came back with static and then silence. Maria tried again. Silence. Before, silence was rest. That afternoon, silence was absence, and absence was what no one accepted. She routed the request to the nearest police station and to the medical service, but she knew, as she did it, that the person on the other end wanted more than a connection. They wanted someone to cross the distance and open a door. They wanted the wire to be a hand, and the exchange to do what no switchboard had been built to do. At 6, the peak reached a point where small errors began to appear: a plug in the wrong place, an address reversed, a request to hold sent to the wrong line. Tiny things that, under load, could become a diversion. Mrs. Kavanaugh hardened further. A paper fell to the floor near position 18, and the supervisor demanded order without raising her voice, as if restraint were part of control, and as if raising the tone would admit control had already been lost. Maria picked up the paper and smoothed it with her palm, her hand barely trembling. The entire room seemed held up by discipline and fatigue, like a bridge under too much weight, with the heat of equipment and bodies accumulating in the air and making each breath shorter. Then came the call that became the irreversible event of Maria's night. Not because the fire ceased to be the greatest fact, but because something crossed the barrier of work and entered her life with name and body. The voice on the other end was male, young, familiar enough that her body recognized it before her mind did. It was Joaquim, her youngest brother, a delivery boy for a grocery on 9th Avenue. He should not have been calling the exchange. There was no acceptable reason for it, and the very idea of using the exchange as a shortcut went against internal rules. The simple fact that he was on that line was like hearing footsteps in the hallway at midnight, a sound that should not exist, and for that very reason announced that something was wrong. His call carried street noise and urgency, and the information came mixed with images he could not hold steady. Fire near Washington Place, people on the ground, clothes burning, the need for someone who understood Portuguese because there were girls screaming. Maria felt a dry vertigo. There was no room for a sister's response. There was only the task of turning that into useful data before the system crushed the information the way it crushed everything that arrived without form. She asked for the exact street and point, and he repeated Greene with Washington Place, mentioned a fire engine and lack of water pressure, something people talked about in fires when hoses did not perform as expected. His voice faltered when he tried to describe what he saw, and in the background someone shouted a short order in English, as if pushing bodies to clear a way, as if the entire street were a narrow corridor. Maria did what protocol did not approve, and yet, in that second, seemed the only way not to lose time. She connected her brother's line directly to the Mercer Street Police Station and to the medical service, creating an improvised bridge. She passed the data, included the request for a Portuguese interpreter, spoke with the trained precision that gave technical authority even when her voice wanted to shake. The response on the other end came impatient, affirming in excess of calls, but the data were written down because the exchange, despite everything, still functioned as a mechanism, and because repetition of information by different witnesses helped fix the point and the need, as if each repetition were another nail holding reality in place. For a few seconds, she kept Joaquim connected to the medical service, so he could repeat what he saw to someone who could send an ambulance. Then she pulled the plug, because another lamp flashed, and another, and another. The clicks sounded like metal striking. The damage was already done in a way that could not be repaired. The tragedy had now crossed into the family through the wires, and Maria could no longer pretend she was carrying only anonymous voices. She was carrying her own home, and that could not be undone. There was no procedure that restored that safe distance. At 6:30, the calls changed again. The news moving through the city was that the fire was under control. What remained were lists and searching. People called hospitals, precincts, churches, and the medical examiner's office. Names repeated with variations and pronunciations. Sarah, Sadie, Sora, Giovanni, John, Esther, Hester. The telephone system was good at connecting and bad at finding, and the system's deficiency showed in the desperation of those asking for an administrative miracle, as if a line could replace a complete record, as if a jack and a cord could produce, out of nothing, the certainty no one had. A call came from St. Vincent's Hospital asking for a connection to a family in Brooklyn. Maria made it. On the other end, the family asked everything at once, and the nurse tried to explain that there was a young woman unconscious who needed identification. Maria heard both ends and felt the exchange turn into a hospital corridor, only without the smell of antiseptic, only the smell of heated metal and sweat, and with the sound of voices that could not see each other, trapped in wires, as if the wires were the only place they could still touch. Later, a request from a newspaper on Park Row sought confirmation of the death toll. Maria had no number. She had broken voices and repeated addresses. She connected to the fire department and heard a brief, technical reply, with no patience for uncertain figures. The certainties were horrible, and what lacked certainty was too. When a shift change should have happened, no one stood up. Some operators were pale, their eyes too fixed. A girl at position 12 cried without sound, tears running down while her fingers kept working, as if her body had found a way to continue without asking permission from her head. Mrs. Kavanaugh, despite her rigidity, set a glass of water on the girl's table without comment. In that room, discipline was what kept the city from becoming a complete knot, and it was also what kept the girls from collapsing before the end. It was a form of restraint that served the work and, without intending to, serve them. Maria continued until 8:30. The flow diminished enough that the silence between one light and the next felt strange, almost offensive, as if the panel had forgotten how to stop. She took off the headset for a moment and massaged her ear, feeling the marked skin. The room held a warm fatigue, like a kitchen after dinner. A small fan turned without much force, moving noise more than air. Mrs. Kavanaugh passed and released them with few words, adding an order not to comment with strangers, as if secrecy could protect the company and also, somehow, the girls, in a time when companies guarded reputation and control of information, even when the entire city was already talking about the same thing. Outside, the city was different. Maria stepped on a West Street and felt the Hudson wind, cold and damp, strike her face like a clean hand, bringing the smell of water and wet wood from the piers. Carriages passed and a few automobiles, but the sound seemed distant, as if she were still inside the exchange's hum. She took the streetcar toward 9th Avenue, and at every corner there were groups talking about the fire, as if talking about war. Newspapers passed from hand to hand, and phrases repeated like a refrain. The name Triangle appeared on people's lips with a new weight, like something concrete, as if it had become part of the city's map. In a cramped room where they lived, the stove was out, and the place smelled of damp clothing, fabric that did not dry well at the end of March. Donna Selena, her mother, sat with her coat still on, like someone who had waited without allowing herself comfort. Her father had not returned from the docks. Joachim came in a few minutes later, his hands dirty with soot that did not come off easily, embedded in the lines of his fingers. He did not tell everything. He took off his cap and remained standing, as if sitting would admit weakness. Donna Selena looked at his hands and understood more than any explanation could bring. What he managed to narrate came in loose images. A girl screaming in a language he did not recognize, men trying to stretch a net, a dry sound when something hit the pavement, shoes lost, hats on the ground, the smell that clung. When he stopped, the room filled with what was not said, and the household routine seemed like something that would have to be rebuilt piece by piece, carefully, as if any abrupt movement could knock down what was still standing. On Sunday morning, March 26th, Maria returned to the exchange. The panel lit less, but each call felt heavier, as if the volume had decreased and the weight had increased. It was the day of families, the day of searching for names in incomplete lists, the day of calling Bellevue, St. Vincent's, the precinct, the medical examiner's office. Maria heard Jewish surnames from the Lower East Side, Italian surnames from Mulberry Street, Irish surnames from Hell's Kitchen, and some Portuguese as well, coming from boarding houses near the docks, where sailors and temporary workers left messages. At noon, a woman asked for a connection to a friend who worked at Triangle. The verb worked, in that context, already carried shadow, as if the word had changed color in 24 hours. Maria connected to hospitals and offices, and the answer was always insufficient, made of not listed and wait, because records took time and bodies arrived without immediate identification. The woman on the other end would not hang up, as if the wire were the only thing keeping her body from falling. Maria kept the line longer than recommended, until she received a short gesture from the supervisor. She pulled the plug, and the click sounded too loud, as if the exchange itself had learned to make noise with endings. On Tuesday, March 28th, a fine rain fell over Manhattan, leaving the sidewalks shining and dark, and water ran into the gutters carrying ash and paper. Leaving her shift, Maria passed near Washington Square and saw, from a distance, the movement on Washington Place. She did not go close to the Greene corner. She did not need to. The neighborhood carried a strange silence, interrupted by wagons and footsteps. There were people with flowers wrapped in paper, people reading names in crumpled newspapers, people standing as if waiting for a door to open. The tall building with its ordinary facade looked older than it should have, as if it had aged in 3 days, and the normality of the brickwork contrasted with what was known to have happened on the floors, as if the entire city had been forced to accept that appearances protected no one. In the following week, calls about the fire diminished, but did not disappear. They returned in bursts. Someone found a name, someone needed a witness, someone looked for a lost handbag, someone wanted to notify a relative in Newark. Maria kept sitting in the chair, adjusting the headset, looking at the panel as always, but now there was a part of the work that was no longer mechanical. When a voice said Washington Place, her forearm tightened as it had that afternoon. When someone said locked door, she thought of the silence on the factory line. When someone said the ladder does not reach, she remembered the note in the corner of the paper, kept folded inside a prayer book, not out of organized faith, but because it was the only way not to let the phrase be lost, not to let the limit become only noise. The irreversible took another form in April, when a letter arrived by mail with the telephone company's letterhead. It was not dismissal, but a formal warning for improper use of a connection on the afternoon of the fire for the unauthorized bridge. The paper was cold, written as if people were only conduits and failures were only numbers, with administrative language of infraction and recurrence. Maria read it twice, seated at the table, and felt her face grow hot, not with shame, but with a silent, powerless anger. The warning meant that a next offense, any offense, could remove her from her post. It was the institution reminding her that even catastrophe had administrative limits, and that those limits would be collected later when the smoke had already settled. She did not tell her father that night. She told only her mother, who kept the letter in the empty biscuit tin where she stored documents, alongside papers that needed to stay dry and intact. Joachim saw the expression on both their faces and understood there was a kind of punishment that made no noise. He grew quieter in the days that followed, as if he still carried the Greene corner in his chest, and now also carried the weight of having been the reason his sister was at risk, a risk that had not been his choice, but that now had the shape of paper and threat. In May, on a clear afternoon, Maria passed Mercer Street after work and saw a group of women gathered, talking about unions, about safety, about doors that should not be locked. Maria did not stop. It was not disdain. It was fatigue and a sense of limit, as if her body had already absorbed enough for an entire season and was still trying to make room for what had entered. Even so, the words safety and door followed her the way the smell of smoke had followed Joachim for days, insisting on returning when it seemed it had already gone away. Summer came, and the heat made the exchange air thick, even with windows open, and the equipment seemed to warm more, with the constant hum and sweat making movements harder. Calls returned to being about business and messages, about visits to Coney Island, about relatives arriving by ship at Ellis Island, about orders and schedules. But from time to time, someone still called asking for an old list for a record for a name. Maria answered in the same neutral tone, and now she knew neutrality was a garment one put on to get through the day, without coming apart. It was not indifference, it was survival, a way to keep functioning when the world demanded too much. At the end of August 1911, on a night when a river breeze crossed Ninth Avenue, Maria found her father sitting with a folded newspaper on his lap. He pointed to a small note about changes in factory safety rules. He did not mention the fire directly. He only let slip a tired word that served for the news and for the time. Late. Maria understood he was speaking of many things at once, and that none of them would return to the exact place they had been before March, because certain dates do not stay on the calendar. They stay in the body and in the way a home breathes. She kept working at the exchange. The warning was filed away, and she began to take extra care with bridges and shortcuts, with times and addresses, with the temptation to fix the world with one more gesture. Joachim found another kind of work and avoided passing through the village when he could. Donna Selena went back to lighting the stove regularly, as if keeping routine were a way to keep the roof in place. The fire did not become, for them, a newspaper story. It became a date the body remembered, a clicking sound that sometimes appeared in the night silence, a short note kept in a closed book. And when, years later, someone mentioned the Triangle Fire, Maria did not correct details or argue numbers. What returned was the clarity of a panel lighting without stopping, taut wires in the ceiling, the rigidity of a supervisor trying to keep an entire system standing, and her brother's voice crossing the line as if crossing smoke. For a few hours on March 25th, 1911, the entire city tried to fit inside a headset, and it did not fit, but each connection made with steady hands served to push help, news, and searching a little farther forward, and in the small room on 9th Avenue, with the Hudson wind coming in through the crack of the window and the folded newspaper on the table, life went on with discreet and definitive marks, like a wire that does not return to the spool after being stretched and yet continues to serve. One needs to pass through. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these often forgotten stories find the audience they deserve. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you as well. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This community stretches across places, generations, and personal histories, brought together by a shared respect for the past. Thank you for being here, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.